Hello scientists! Today we're going to have a brief introduction to cells. It took scientists a long time to figure out that living things are made of cells and a little more about what cells looked like and their function, mostly because they didn't have a lot of great equipment to study them with. The first person who knowingly saw cells was an English scientist named Robert Hooke. In 1663, he used a pretty primitive microscope to look at a piece of cork that was sliced really thin. He didn't know a lot about what these cells were, but he's credited with giving them the name cell. 10 years later, a man named Anton van Leeuwenhoek used a slightly more advanced microscope, and he looked at living cells, which we know today were bacteria and protozoa. Then, not much happens in the recorded history of the discovery of cells. About 150 years later, in 1838, two men named Theodor Schwann and Matthias Schleiden came up with two of the tenets that we use in our modern cell theory. The first is that all organisms are composed of one or more cells. And the second is that the cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in living things. And these two tenets together give us the big idea for this lesson, which is that cells are the building blocks of living things. Shortly after, a scientist named Rudolf Virchow proposed the third component of our modern cell theory, which is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. This is similar to our law of conservation, where we think about the fact that things don't just arise from nothing. And the same is true for living things. A living thing doesn't just magically appear, it has to come from some other living thing. We divide cells into two broad categories, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. One of the main differences between these two cells is how DNA is stored. In prokaryotic cells, the DNA is just loose in the cell. It often forms rings that we call plasmids. Prokaryotic cells also don't have what we would think of as traditional organelles or membrane-bound structures inside of the cell. Prokaryotic cells are usually smaller and simpler than eukaryotic cells, and living things that have prokaryotic cells include bacteria and archaea. They are simple organisms and unicellular. Eukaryotic cells have DNA that's stored in a membrane-bound structure called the nucleus. And the word eukaryotic actually means true nucleus. Eukaryotic cells tend to be more complex, and they have other membrane-bound structures called organelles that perform specific functions within the cell. We divide them into plant and animal cells based on the structure and the function of the cells, and of course the living things that we find that have these cells, which include plants, animals, fungi, and protists. That's it for today. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below.